Hello out there. This is my attempt to begin a food journal of sorts. Maybe others will find it neat, maybe it'll just be me talking to myself. Either way, I get to make food, so I really can't complain. I'm starting off this crummy video with something age-old and fairly basic. Bread. Specifically sourdough bread. It's a form of bread that goes way back to probably some ancient Egyptian guy leaving his dough out and coming back to find it had gotten bubbly thanks to wild yeast. With that, the world of bread expanded. I love how many great discoveries, honestly, have come out of people forgetting their food for too long. Oops, now it's fermented! Anyway, the key to a good loaf of sourdough is the starter, so we'll start there. A starter is a mixture of flour and water, inhabited by various beneficial cultures, particularly wild yeasts. If you'll forgive a quick foray into some chemistry, when lacking oxygen, yeast breaks down carbohydrates called starch, which are made of strings of glucose molecules, which is a type of sugar, into ethanol, an alcohol, and carbon dioxide. It's carbon dioxide gas, or CO2, that causes bubbly dough and a tasty, well-risen bread. And it's all thanks to these tiny fungi called yeast. How do we repay them? That's right, we bake and eat them. A starter, this is mine, can be cultivated by mixing flour and water and waiting a few days, since yeast is actually on many foods already, like flour, or by acquiring some starter from elsewhere to avoid some of the trouble. Either way, it's important to learn how to feed the starter to keep it happy and alive for repeated baking. In my experience, yeast can put up with quite a lot, including a lazy human caretaker. Feeding for me simply entails discarding part of the starter mixture and then adding in equal amounts of water and flour. I currently use 70% bread flour and 30% whole wheat flour, though really any flour can be used. Distilled water can be used to avoid impurities affecting yeast health, but I just use tap water because lazy. Equal parts water and flour ensure a 100% hydration starter, which is, in my experience, most common, although you can see recipes that differ from that. Starter should usually be used in bread baking when it's reached its peak activity, which is largely dependent on temperature, but typically happens 4 to 12 hours after feeding. If you see here, I've marked with some dry erase marker where the starter was last night when I fed it, and as you can see, it's risen quite a bit. So this is ready for baking. Alright, we're finally ready to get to the bread. I'm basing this video loosely on a recipe from a book called Crusts by Barbara Elise Caracciolo. It will make a single large sourdough loaf. First, I prep the ingredients. I weigh most of my ingredients while baking with a kitchen scale, specifically this Escali scale right now. It's pretty good. I've prepped 150 grams of sourdough starter, 350 grams of room temperature water, the temperature is very important, as well as a combination of 350 grams of bread flour and 150 grams of whole wheat flour, as well as 10 grams of salt. Now, we're going to combine the water and the sourdough starter in a large bowl. Add the flour to the wet ingredients and mix everything together thoroughly. Next, cover and let the mixed dough rest for about 20 minutes. Add in the salt and knead for a few minutes. I usually like doing this by hand and getting a bit messy, because why not? Just use some water or neutrally flavored oil on your hands to minimize the sticking. For the next 1.5 hours, I will perform a series of periodic stretches and folds. I start by waiting 10 minutes, and then every 20 minutes, I do this method to build gluten structure while keeping a more open and airy crumb. This essentially just means bigger holes in the final loaf structure. Proteins called glutenin and gliadin in flour, when combined with water, form strands of gluten, giving bread its structure that will then be lifted by the CO2 gas. Alright, stretch and fold. To stretch and fold, wet your hands a bit, grab the dough on each end, ooh, sticky, and stretch one end, then fold it to the other side. Rotate the bowl 180 degrees, excuse me, and do the same thing. Then 90 degrees, stretch, fold, then 180 again, and stretch and fold. Once you've done that for all 4 sides, you then flip the bread, flip the dough. And again, we're going to repeat this a few different times, about 4 for the remainder of the hour and a half. After about an hour and a half of the periodic stretch and folds, we're going to once again rest the dough for another hour and a half, or until approximately doubled. This second rise I typically do in what's called a Brotform or Banneton. Looks like this. And this is just to help keep the shape, and also I like that it imparts a nice spiral pattern on the bread. Although you can also put a towel in there if you don't want that. Make sure it's nice and dusted with flour. You could also just leave it in the bowl to rise. I prefer this. Before that though, in order to get some good surface tension, I take the dough, get a lightly floured cutting board, and dust a little bit more flour on there, I think. But what we're going to do is we're going to take the dough in both of our hands and pull it, turn, pull it, turn, pull it, turn repeatedly. And this is just increasing the tension of the dough on the top of the loaf. This just helps to get a nice solid rise while in the oven, and I think it also smooths out the top a bit nicer. So once you've done that a bit and it looks pretty decent, yeah, nice and round, smooth. Once we have this, we're going to now let it rest in this guy. So flip it upside down. You want the nice smooth part on the bottom. Again, that's just going to get the nice pattern while it rises. Something like that. And I'm going to cover this and leave it. While this dough is rising and the yeast is working its wonders, preheat the oven to its maximum temperature. This oven that I have is a Samsung oven, conventional oven. It goes up to 550 degrees Fahrenheit. So I have it warming up to that. And I also have a pizza stone in here. It's very handy. It's not necessary, but it just helps have a pretty uniform temperature in the oven. And also it's nice to put the bread on. Once the bread has risen again, I prefer to turn the dough out onto either a pizza peel dusted with semolina flour, you can also use cornmeal, or a piece of parchment paper on a pizza peel. I suppose you could also just use parchment paper, but I like to do this since I have it. So this is what that looks like. Makes it very easy to slide into the oven. As a side note, be careful with the dough when you're putting it onto here, or else you'll end up with flatbread after all. Alright, so we flip this. There we go. Nice. Yeah, so you get that really nice pattern on there. At this point, I sprinkle a little bit more flour over the dough, and I take what's called a bread lahm, not lame. This one's Baker of Seville brand one. Although you can find a lot of them online. And you're going to quickly score the dough however you want. You can do all sorts of pretty designs. I just usually do something fairly simple. However, you should make sure that the scores are deep enough to allow the bread to expand as it rises, but not too deep and certainly not too shallow. So yeah, it helps actually to wet the lahm a little bit, and you're just going to take some quick cuts across here. And I like to do some fancy extra marks. Yeah, so this will just let the bread breathe and not break apart where I don't want it to. Now, if you'll bear with me, we're going to bring this prepped dough over to the heated oven. Get it on my nice pizza stone here. Spray some water in here. This mist is just going to help with oven spring, also known as just the critical rise at the beginning of the bake. Keep the oven at 460 for 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, open the door and release the steam. Ooh, coming along. Now it just needs to brown to that color that we all want in bread. So I'm going to drop the temperature down to 410. Now we'll bake another 25 to 30 minutes, or until it's the golden brown that we're looking for. Finally, remove the bread from the oven and let it cool. Now, the bread will continue to bake internally while it cools. Actually, if you get really close with your ear, you can actually typically hear pleasant little crackling noises. Once cooled, you can cut and serve the bread, or you can wrap it up and store it for later use. And now you have some beautiful homemade bread. I mean, sure, you can get the bread from the store, but you can't really beat the feeling of homemade, and certainly not the taste. Alright, go and enjoy your homemade bread. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, be well, and remember to imagine yourself happy.